Let me tell you about the best laugh I've had in 3 years. I was standing at my kitchen counter in a bathrobe, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, when I opened an envelope I almost didn't bother picking up. It had a law firm's return address printed in that clean, authoritative font that's designed to make you feel small before you've even broken the seal. I read the first paragraph, then the second. Then I set the letter down, pressed both hands flat on the counter and started laughing. Not a polite chuckle. Not a nervous giggle. A full, chest-deep, eyes-watering laugh that bounced off the kitchen cabinets and probably scared my neighbor's dog through the wall. My husband Marcus walked in from the hallway, still half asleep, and stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. Or maybe I'd finally found it. Because that letter, the one my family's attorney mailed me after 3 years of complete silence, wasn't the threat they thought it was. It was the answer to a question I'd been carrying since the worst night of my life. And the person who answered it had been gone for 4 years. Before I tell you what was in that letter, I want to say something to anyone who's ever been the family member that got quietly written off. The one who was never quite enough, never quite worth the effort, never quite the favorite. Fats, you stay with me. Because this story is for you. And if you want more stories like this one, go ahead and hit subscribe right now. I put out new content every week and I promise you, it only gets better from here. Now, let me take you back to Clarksdale, Mississippi. And to the family that taught me slowly and then all at once, exactly what I was worth to them. My name is Reese Merritt. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in Clarksdale in a house on Beaumont Drive that looked, from the outside, like the kind of home you'd describe as blessed. My father, Franklin Merritt, owned the most successful insurance brokerage in the county. Merritt and Associates had its name on a building downtown and its logo on the back page of the church bulletin every single Sunday. My mother, Cynthia, taught second grade at the elementary school for 22 years and was the kind of woman who brought casseroles to funerals and remembered every birthday without a calendar. Together, they were the Merritts of Clarksdale. Respected. Established. The kind of family that other families pointed to. And then there was my brother, Preston. 2 years older, broad-shouldered, the kind of easy confidence that fills a room without trying. Preston was the one my father took to Rotary Club dinners. Preston was the one my mother bragged about at the teacher's lounge. Preston got the car, the college fund, the Sunday dinners where Franklin sat at the head of the table and talked about the future like it was a blueprint he'd already drawn up, and Preston's name was printed at the top of every page. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I know the words selfish and ungrateful are already loading in some people's minds. So let me be specific. My parents fed me. They clothed me. They kept the lights on. There was no screaming, no hitting, no dramatic cruelty. What there was, instead, was something quieter and in some ways harder to explain. There was a pattern of subtraction. A way of making decisions that always tilted in Preston's direction, and when I asked about it, when I was brave enough or frustrated enough to say something, my father had a line he used like a tool. He'd look at me from across whatever room we were in, patient and unbothered, and say, "Reese, your brother needs more support right now. You've always been the capable one." The capable one. I heard that phrase so many times growing up that I started to believe it meant something good. It took me until my mid-20s to understand that in my father's vocabulary, capable didn't mean strong. It meant self-sufficient enough that he didn't have to think about me. It meant she'll figure it out on her own. It meant I can redirect those resources somewhere else and she won't make a scene about it. And I didn't. For a long time I didn't make a single scene. I worked through high school. Not because I had to, but because it became clear early that the things I wanted, the things I needed, weren't going to come from asking. I waitressed on weekends at a diner off Highway 61 and saved every dollar in a shoebox under my bed like some Depression-era grandmother. I applied for scholarships without telling anyone. I got into the University of Mississippi on an academic grant and a combination of financial aid and my own savings. My parents said they'd come to orientation. Preston had a golf tournament that weekend. They went to the golf tournament. The only person who showed up was my grandmother. Loretta Merritt. My father's mother. She drove 2 hours in a powder blue Buick that had no business being on the highway anymore, wearing her good church hat and carrying a card with a $20 bill inside. She pressed the card into my hand in the parking lot and said, "Baby, I have been watching you work for this your whole life and I am so proud of you I could burst." Her eyes were wet and she kept patting my hand like she was trying to transfer something through her palm. Grandma Loretta was the one who named me. Not a lot of people knew that. My parents had wanted something else entirely, something more traditional, but Loretta had held me in the hospital the day I was born and said I looked like a Reese. Said I had the face of someone who would know exactly who she was. My mother laughed and let her have it, and I've been Reese ever since. That detail mattered to me more than I can explain. She named me before anyone knew who I'd turn out to be. She just decided I was worth naming carefully. I met Marcus Webb in my junior year of college. He was finishing a degree in civil engineering and picking up shifts at the campus library to cover his rent. He was the kind of quiet that isn't emptiness but depth, the kind of person who listens like what you're saying actually matters, who asks the follow-up question that tells you he was paying attention. We dated for 2 years, moved in together after graduation, and got married when I was 27 in a small outdoor ceremony at a park near our apartment in Jackson. It rained for 20 minutes right before the vows and stopped just in time. Grandma Loretta sat in the front row in a yellow dress and cried from the moment I appeared until well after the reception started. My parents came. They were polite. They shook Marcus's hand and smiled for the photos and left before the cake was cut because Preston and his wife had a dinner reservation in Memphis that night. My father told me on his way out, voice low, almost kind, that he thought Marcus seemed like a decent enough man, but that he hoped I wasn't selling myself short. I stood in my wedding dress in a park in Jackson, Mississippi, holding a bouquet of wildflowers Marcus had picked out himself, and smiled at my father like he hadn't just said what he said. Marcus and I drove home that night without talking much. When we finally got inside, he sat on the edge of the bed, loosened his tie and looked at me. "You know what your dad said to me when you were getting your photos done?" I shook my head. He said, "Make sure you can provide for her because she's not someone who asks for help." Marcus paused. I don't think he meant it as a compliment. I didn't say anything. I just reached over and took his hand. Because the thing is, I already knew. I had known for a long time. It just hit differently on your wedding day. Grandma Loretta pulled me aside near the end of the reception, before the rain started again and before half the guests made their excuses. She held both my hands and looked at me with those sharp brown eyes that had seen everything this family had ever tried to hide. "I've already taken care of something," she said. Just like that. Quiet, certain, like she was telling me the weather. I assumed she was talking about a wedding gift. Maybe a check. Maybe a piece of jewelry she'd been saving. I hugged her and told her she didn't have to do anything, that her being there was enough. She just smiled and squeezed my hands one more time. "You'll understand when the time comes, baby." I didn't ask what she meant. I should have. But Grandma Loretta had a way of saying things that felt complete, like the conversation was finished before it started. So I let it go. I filed it in the back of my mind under things I'd think about later. And then later became 3 years, and 3 years became a Tuesday morning, and that Tuesday morning became the day a letter arrived from a law firm I'd never heard of, with my name printed on the envelope in ink so clean and deliberate it looked like someone had been waiting a long time to send it. 3 years of silence. Not a birthday text. Not a forwarded email. Not a single voicemail that wasn't about something they needed. And then, out of nowhere, a law firm. I set my coffee mug down, picked that letter back up and read it one more time. And that's when I laughed. Because Grandma Loretta, God rest her soul, had been 3 steps ahead of all of them the entire time. The night everything fell apart started with a dinner that was supposed to be a celebration. Preston had just landed a contract with a commercial real estate developer out of Memphis. Significant deal, the kind that puts a man's name on a conference room whiteboard and earns him a firm handshake from people who don't give those out easily. My father called it a milestone. My mother made her peach cobbler, the one she only brought out for occasions that mattered. The whole extended family was invited. Aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbors who had known the Merritts long enough to feel like furniture in the house. I drove in from Jackson with Marcus, and I remember thinking on the way there that I genuinely wanted to enjoy it. That I was going to sit at that table, eat that cobbler, and be happy for my brother without keeping score. Almost made it. We were an hour into dinner when Franklin stood up from his chair at the head of the table and raised his glass. He talked about Preston for 4 minutes straight. I counted. He talked about legacy and leadership, and what it meant to carry the Merritt name forward with integrity. He talked about the years of hard work, the sacrifices, the early mornings. He cried a little at the end, the way men like my father cry, quickly and with a cough to cover it, before sitting back down like it hadn't happened. The table applauded. My mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin. And I sat there with my hands in my lap and my wine untouched because 2 months earlier, I had passed the CPA exam on my first attempt after 18 months of studying while working full-time, and my father had responded to that news with a text message that said, "Good job, kiddo. Proud of you." 7 words. No period. Auto-corrected. I'm not telling you that to make Preston the villain. He worked hard. The deal was real. The celebration was deserved. I am telling you because the disparity, laid out plainly in the space of one dinner table, was so clear and so old that I felt something shift in my chest that night. Not break. Like a foundation that's been settling for years finally finding its new position with a sound you can't ignore. It was my cousin Dana who lit the actual fuse, though she didn't mean to. She cornered me in the kitchen while I was refilling my water glass and asked, in the bright, innocent tone of someone who genuinely has no idea they're stepping on a live wire, whether Marcus and I were thinking about buying a house. I said we were saving for a down payment. She tilted her head and said, "Oh, I thought your dad might help you out with that the way he did with Preston's place." I looked at her. She looked back at me. And then she realized from whatever she saw on my face, that she had just handed me information I wasn't supposed to have. My father had helped Preston buy his house. Not a loan. A gift. $50,000 according to Dana, who immediately started backtracking and saying she might have the number wrong and she probably shouldn't have said anything. I told her it was fine. I smiled. I went back to the dining room, sat down next to Marcus and spent the next 40 minutes being very, very quiet. Marcus knew something was wrong before we even got to the car. He knows my quiet the way a contractor knows which walls are load-bearing, by feel, by experience, by the particular stillness that means something structural is happening underneath. On the drive back to Jackson he didn't push. He just drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near mine on the console, close enough that I could reach it if I needed to. I didn't bring it up that night. I carried it for 2 weeks, turning it over, checking it from every angle, making sure I wasn't being irrational. I thought about all the times I'd asked, not demanded, just asked, whether there was any possibility of help with my student loans when the interest was eating me alive in my first year after graduation. My father had said he wished he could, but that money was tight. I thought about the summer I needed a root canal and didn't have dental coverage yet and paid for it on a credit card I spent 8 months paying off. I thought about every year I filed my taxes and wrote a check and did it alone while knowing from the outside that the Merritts of Clarksdale were not a family short on resources. Then I drove back to Clarksdale on a Saturday and asked my father directly. I caught him in his home office, the one with the mahogany desk and the framed photo of him shaking hands with the county commissioner. I closed the door. I sat down across from him. And I asked him as calmly as I could manage, whether it was true that he had given Preston money to buy his house. Franklin looked at me for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has been caught not doing anything wrong in his own estimation, but knows the conversation is about to become inconvenient. Then he leaned back in his chair and said yes. He said it plainly without apology, the way you'd confirm a weather forecast. Yes, he had. Preston needed a stable foundation to build his professional life from. It was an investment in the family's future. I asked him why he hadn't offered me the same thing. He said, and I want to be precise here because I have replayed this sentence more times than I can count. "Reese, you and Marcus are fine. You've always figured things out. That's one of the things I admire most about you." There it was again. Dressed up differently this time. Not the capable one. Now admirable. Now something he was proud of. Still the same sentence with the same meaning underneath. You don't need anything. Therefore I don't have to give you anything. The logic was so clean and so self-serving that for a second I almost admired the architecture of it. Almost. I told him I wasn't fine with it. I told him steadily that I had spent my entire adult life being treated like a tenant in my own family, present at every gathering, responsible for my own everything, and invisible the moment something was actually being given out. I told him that I didn't want the $50,000. I wasn't there to ask for money. I was there because I wanted him to understand what the pattern looked like from where I was standing. My father listened. He nodded in a few places. And when I finished he said, "I think you're being a little dramatic, sweetheart. This is a family, not a ledger." My mother appeared in the doorway. I don't know how long she'd been there. Long enough. She looked at me with the expression she reserved for situations she had already decided were my fault and said, "You've upset your father, Reese. On a Saturday." Those exact words. On a Saturday. Like the day of the week was the offense. I stood up. I thanked my father for his time, which I said with enough composure that he couldn't call it sarcasm even though it was. I walked past my mother in the doorway. I got in my car and I drove back to Jackson, and I did not cry until I was on the highway with Clarksdale in my rearview mirror and the flat Mississippi farmland opening up on both sides like the world was giving me room to fall apart. Marcus was waiting on the porch when I pulled in. He stood up when he saw my face. He didn't say anything. He just walked down the steps and met me at the car and held me in the driveway for a long time while I said nothing and he asked for nothing, and the streetlight made a yellow circle around us like the smallest, quietest room in the world. 2 weeks later my phone rang. It was Franklin. Not to apologize. To tell me that he had spoken to Preston and to some of the extended family, and that the general feeling was that I had been going through a hard time lately and that perhaps Marcus and I should consider talking to someone professionally. He said it with genuine concern in his voice, or at least a very convincing imitation of it. He said he was only bringing it up because he cared about me. He said the family was worried. I asked him who specifically had expressed concern. He said it was more of a general feeling. I told him I appreciated the call and hung up. Then I sat on the kitchen floor because the couch felt too far away and I needed to be closer to the ground. Marcus came in, saw me, and sat down on the floor next to me without a single word of explanation requested or given. We sat there for probably 10 minutes. Then he said quietly, "They're going to keep doing this until you stop letting them define the terms." I looked at him. He looked back. "You've been writing their version of you your whole life, Reese. Maybe it's time to put the pen down." I didn't go back to Clarksdale for Christmas that year. Hice una carta. Nobody called. And just like that, 3 years of silence began, not with a door slamming but with a card in a mailbox and a phone that stayed quiet on Christmas morning while Marcus made pancakes and the dog knocked over the tree stand and we laughed until we were useless on the kitchen floor, and it was, genuinely, the best Christmas I'd had in years. But silence, as I was about to learn, has an expiration date. And when my family finally decided to break theirs, they didn't call. They sent a lawyer. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I opened it. I want you to understand that. 3 days. It arrived on a Tuesday and I opened it on a Friday morning, and in between I walked past it approximately 40 times, each time doing the same thing, glancing at it, clocking the law firm name on the return address, and deciding that whatever was inside it could wait a little longer. Marcus noticed it on Wednesday night. He looked at it, looked at me, and said nothing. That's one of the things I love most about him. He understands the difference between a thing that needs to be handled immediately and a thing that a person needs to arrive at in their own time. The firm was called Hadley & Croft, based in Clarksdale. I'd never heard of them. The envelope was addressed specifically to Reese A. Webb, which was my legal name since the marriage, and the precision of it, the fact that someone had looked up my married name and current address and put both on an envelope with a law firm's return address, told me before I'd read a single word that this was not casual. This was prepared. 3 years of silence, and the first move my family made was to hire someone. I opened it Friday morning. Marcus had already left for a site inspection. The coffee was fresh. The house was quiet except for the ceiling fan turning slowly in the hallway and the sound of a neighbor's lawnmower somewhere outside. I sat at the kitchen table, slid my finger under the seal, and unfolded a single sheet of crisp white paper with the Hadley & Croft letterhead across the top. The letter informed me that I was being contacted as a named party in a matter concerning the estate of Loretta May Merritt, my grandmother, who had passed away 16 months prior. I already knew she was gone. I had found out through Dana, who texted me the morning after the funeral to say she was sorry I hadn't been there, which was the first I'd heard of it. Nobody had called me. Nobody had told me she was sick. Nobody had told me she had died until she was already in the ground and the flowers on her casket had already started to wilt. I had grieved Grandma Loretta in my own way, quietly, in the house she'd never visited but would have loved, in the Jackson apartment with the big kitchen window she would have stood at and said something warm about the light. I had grieved her without a funeral, without a grave to sit beside, without any of the rituals that are supposed to help. I had just woken up one day, read Dana's text, sat very still for a long time, and then gone about my life because that was what I did. That was what I had always done. The letter from Hadley & Croft informed me that Loretta Merritt's estate included a financial instrument, specifically a funded irrevocable trust established in my name 7 years prior, and that as the sole named beneficiary, I was required to appear in person at their office to complete the transfer of assets. The trust, according to the letter, had been managed by an independent trustee, a woman named Patricia Gould, a certified financial planner based out of Oxford, Mississippi, who had been administering it since its creation. The assets, the letter noted, were substantial. That was the word they used. Substantial. I read the letter twice. Then I set it on the table and looked out the kitchen window at the neighbor's magnolia tree, which was doing what magnolia trees in Mississippi do in late spring, blooming so aggressively it looked almost aggressive about it, like it had a point to prove. I thought about Grandma Loretta at my wedding in her yellow dress. I thought about her hands on mine in the parking lot at orientation. I thought about what she'd said at the reception. I've already taken care of something. I thought about the way she'd smiled when I told her she didn't have to do anything. That smile. Certain and calm and carrying a secret she'd apparently been carrying for 7 years. Then I picked up my phone and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the background noise of a construction site, wind and distant machinery and men calling to each other about measurements. I told him to find somewhere quiet. There was a pause, some shuffling, and then the background noise dropped. I read him the letter. When I finished, the line was silent for several seconds. Then he said, in the tone of a man doing rapid mental calculations, "Your grandmother set up a trust for you 7 years ago and nobody told you." "That's right," I said. "And it's been sitting there this whole time." "That's right," I said again. Another pause. "Reese." "Yeah. She knew." "I know." I called Patricia Gould's office that same afternoon. Her assistant put me through immediately, which told me the call had been anticipated. Patricia Gould's voice was measured and professional and carried the particular warmth of someone who has been holding something safe for a long time and is genuinely glad to be handing it over. She confirmed everything in the letter. Loretta Merritt had come to her 7 years ago, referred by a mutual acquaintance, and had asked her to establish an irrevocable trust funded with a portion of assets Loretta had accumulated privately over decades, a combination of savings, a small inheritance of her own that nobody in the Merritt family had apparently known about, and the proceeds from a piece of land she had quietly sold the year before she came to Patricia's office. The trust had been structured specifically so that it bypassed probate entirely. It did not appear in Loretta's will, which Franklin Merritt had apparently overseen and considered settled. It did not pass through the estate. It existed completely outside the machinery of the Merritt family finances. Patricia Gould had been depositing the returns into a managed account for 7 years, and with conservative growth the total had reached, she told me with the same calm you'd use to describe the weather, $240,000. I was sitting on the back step of my house when she said that number. I remember the exact feeling of the concrete under me, slightly warm from the afternoon sun, solid in a way that felt necessary. I wrote the number down on the back of the Hadley and Croft envelope in my own handwriting and stared at it for a moment. $240,000. Placed there by a woman in a church hat who drove a powder blue Buick and cried at my wedding and never once, not once, made me feel like a burden. I asked Patricia Gould when Loretta had established the trust. He told me the date. I pulled up the calendar on my phone and counted backward. Loretta had walked into Patricia's office 3 weeks after my wedding. 3 weeks after standing in the front row in her yellow dress. 3 weeks after holding my hands and telling me she had already taken care of something. She had gone home from my wedding, looked at what she had, decided what it meant and done something about it. Quietly. Completely outside anyone else's awareness. The way she did everything that actually mattered. I asked Patricia one more question. I asked whether Franklin Merritt had been notified about the trust. Patricia paused, choosing her words with the care of a woman who has been in rooms where things go wrong. She told me that Loretta had been explicit in her instructions. Franklin was not to be informed during Loretta's lifetime. Upon Loretta's passing, the trustee was to contact me directly and complete the transfer without involving the broader estate. Patricia had followed those instructions precisely. She had contacted me through Hadley and Croft as the estate's processing firm, using my married name and current address, which Loretta had provided and updated 2 years before she died, meaning that even in her final years, even when I had been cut off and written out of the family narrative, Loretta had kept track of where I was. She knew my address. She knew my married name. She had updated the paperwork. She had been watching from a distance and making sure the door was still open. I stayed on the back step for a long time after I hung up. The magnolia in the neighbor's yard was visible over the fence, white flowers heavy on the branches. I thought about all the mornings Grandma Loretta must have woken up, gone about her life in Clarksdale, watched Franklin pour everything into Preston, watched me show up and work and ask for nothing and receive less, and decided, in whatever way a woman of her generation decided such things, that she was going to correct it. Not loudly. Not publicly. Not with a confrontation at a dinner table or a speech at a family gathering. Just with paperwork. Just with a number and a name on a document that would sit quietly in a filing cabinet in Oxford, Mississippi, earning interest, waiting for the right moment, which happened to arrive in the form of a law firm envelope on a Tuesday that I finally opened on a Friday. And then it hit me. If Grandma Loretta's estate had been settled by Franklin, and if the trust had bypassed probate entirely, then my father had closed out his mother's estate without ever knowing this existed. He had stood in a lawyer's office, signed documents, distributed what he thought was everything, and walked away believing the matter was finished. He had no idea. For 16 months he had no idea. And now, somehow he had found out. Which meant the letter I was holding wasn't just a notification. It was a warning. Franklin Merritt had learned that his mother had gone around him. And I was about to find out exactly how he planned to respond. Franklin called on a Sunday evening which told me everything about his strategy before he said a single word. Sunday evening is a calculated time to call someone you need something from. The week hasn't started yet, defenses are slightly lower, the day has a softness to it that weekdays don't. I had been expecting the call since Friday when I'd spoken to Patricia Gould, and I had spent the 2 days in between doing what I do when something important is coming. I prepared. Not emotionally, I was past that. I mean practically. I pulled the Hadley and Croft letter back out, reread it 3 times, called Patricia Gould's office and asked for a full summary of the trust documentation to be sent to my email, and then spent Saturday morning reading every page of it at the kitchen table with a highlighter and a notepad while Marcus sat across from me reading a book and occasionally refilling my coffee without being asked. When my phone lit up Sunday night and I saw the name Franklin Merritt on the screen for the first time in 3 years, I felt my chest tighten. Not from fear. From the particular tension of someone who has spent 3 years healing a wound and now has to sit in a room with whatever caused it. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. His voice was the same. That was the first thing I registered. 3 years, and it was exactly the same, that measured, unhurried baritone that Franklin Merritt had spent a lifetime perfecting for conference rooms and church pews and kitchen table conversations where he needed to be the most reasonable person present. He said my name the way he always had, with the faint emphasis on the first syllable that managed to sound both familiar and slightly condescending at the same time. Reese. Like a statement. Like he was identifying something he had misplaced. He said he was calling because he assumed I'd received some correspondence and he wanted to get ahead of any confusion. That word. Confusion. I wrote it on my notepad and underlined it. He wasn't calling because he was sorry. He wasn't calling because 3 years had passed and I was his daughter. He was calling to manage a narrative before it got away from him, and he was dressing that management in the language of paternal concern. I recognized the technique. I had been on the receiving end of it my entire life. He told me that there had been some irregularities in his mother's estate that his attorney had recently identified. He said that Loretta in her later years had made some financial decisions that weren't entirely sound, and that the family was working to understand the full picture. He said he wanted me to know that whatever I had been told by whoever had contacted me, the situation was more complicated than it appeared, and that it would be in everyone's best interest if I came to Clarksdale so we could sit down together and work through it as a family. As a family. 3 years of silence. No call when Grandma Loretta got sick. No call when she died. No call on my birthday or Marcus's birthday or any morning in between when it might have occurred to him to pick up the phone and say something honest. And now, the moment money entered the picture, we were a family again. Kept my voice even. I told him I had spoken to Patricia Gould and that I understood the situation clearly. There was a pause on his end, a recalibration, the sound of a man who had expected his opening move to land differently. He shifted. Told me that Patricia Gould was a third party who had been engaged under circumstances that were, at best, questionable, and that the trust itself might have been established at a time when Loretta's judgment was not what it should have been. He used the phrase cognitive decline. He said it carefully with what sounded like genuine sorrow, the way a person says something they've rehearsed enough times that the rehearsal no longer shows. His own mother. He was suggesting his own mother hadn't been of sound mind. And he was doing it to a phone to me on a Sunday evening, 3 years into a silence he had never once tried to break for any reason other than this. I asked him when exactly he believed Loretta's cognitive decline had begun. He said it was hard to pinpoint. I told him that Patricia Gould had documentation showing the trust was reviewed and updated 2 years before Loretta passed, and that the updates included my current address, which Loretta had provided herself. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear him breathing, and I could hear, underneath that, the particular quality of a man whose prepared script has just been handed back to him with corrections. He told me he wasn't trying to make this adversarial. I told him I wasn't either. He told me that Preston had a family to think about and that the financial situation had been difficult lately and that Loretta would have wanted everyone taken care of. I asked him quietly whether Loretta had expressed that directly, or whether that was his interpretation of what she would have wanted. He didn't answer that one. He moved on the way he always moved on when a question became inconvenient, by introducing a new topic at a slightly increased volume. He said he had retained an attorney and was exploring the family's options. He said the word challenge, as in the family might need to challenge certain elements of the estate proceedings. I wrote that word down too and circled it. He said he hoped it wouldn't come to that and that a conversation in person would probably resolve everything more cleanly than lawyers going back and forth. He said he was sure we could find a solution that felt fair to everyone. That phrase. Fair to everyone. The same man who had given Preston $50,000 without telling me and called it an investment in the family's future was now using the word fair. I told him I would think about coming to Clarksdale. He said he was glad to hear it. We ended the call with the stiff, careful politeness of two people who are not actually being polite, and I set my phone face down on the kitchen table and sat for a moment in the quiet. Marcus was in the doorway. He had heard enough of my side to understand the shape of it. I looked at him and said, "He wants to challenge the trust." Marcus came in and sat down across from me. "On what grounds?" "Cognitive decline," I said. Marcus looked at me for a moment. Then he said very flatly, "Your grandmother updated that paperwork 2 years before she died." "I know. And she kept your address current while your own father didn't call you for 3 years." "I know." He leaned back in his chair. "So he's going to walk into a courtroom and argue that the woman who was sharp enough to maintain a legal financial instrument for 7 years wasn't sharp enough to decide who she wanted to leave her money to." When he put it that way, the whole thing became very clear. I called Patricia Gould first thing Monday morning. I explained the call. She listened without interrupting, which I had come to understand was simply how she operated: complete attention, no reaction until she had heard everything. When I finished, she said she had been anticipating this possibility and had already been in contact with the attorney at Hadley and Croft. She said the trust documentation was airtight. Loretta had undergone a formal capacity evaluation at the time the trust was established, an independent assessment conducted by a licensed psychologist and filed with the trust documents, which was not standard practice but which Loretta had apparently insisted upon. Patricia's voice carried something when she said that. Not quite admiration but adjacent to it. "Your grandmother knew this day might come," she said. "She made sure there was nothing to challenge." I sat with that for a moment. Loretta Merritt, in her church hat in her powder blue Buick, had walked into a financial planner's office, established a trust, funded it, had herself formally evaluated for legal capacity, updated the paperwork periodically, and done all of it without telling a single member of her family. She had anticipated her own son's response to this with enough precision to neutralize it before he ever had the chance to try. That level of quiet, patient, deliberate protection was staggering to me. It still is. I told Patricia I wanted to be prepared for whatever Franklin's attorney filed. She told me that Hadley and Croft would handle any legal challenges on my behalf at no additional cost, as the trust documents provided for that contingency. Loretta had thought of that too. Of course she had. I thanked Patricia and hung up and went to work because I was a CPA with a caseload and a deadline and a life that had been running cleanly for 3 years without my family in it, and I was not going to let a Sunday evening phone call dismantle what I had built. But I did make one decision that morning. I was going to go to Clarksdale. Not because Franklin had asked me to. Not because I wanted a resolution that felt fair to everyone. I was going because Grandma Loretta had spent 7 years building something for me in silence. And the least I could do was walk into that town and receive it standing up, in person, in the same building where my father had spent decades being the most important Merritt in every room. I called Hadley and Croft and scheduled the asset transfer appointment for the following Friday. Then I called Dana and asked if she could meet me for coffee when I was in town. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I packed a bag that night. Marcus offered to come. I shook my head. Some things you have to do in your own name with your own 2 feet, in the town that taught you what you were worth. And I had a few things to say to that town before I was done. I drove into Clarksdale on a Friday morning with a folder of documents on the passenger seat. The drive from Jackson takes just under 2 hours on a good day. Flat highway, cotton fields on both sides, the occasional water tower with the town's name painted on it in letters that were bold when someone's grandfather put them up and have been fading politely ever since. I had made this drive hundreds of times in my life. Going home for holidays, going back for funerals, going back because the pull of a place where you grew up is real even when the place hasn't earned it. This time felt different. This time I wasn't going back to belong to something. I was going back to finish something, and there is a difference between those two things that changes everything about how you hold the steering wheel. I went to Hadley and Croft first. The office was on the 2nd floor of a building on Sunflower Avenue, above a title company, up a stairwell that smelled like old wood and air conditioning that was working too hard. The attorney handling my case was a woman named Claire Odom, mid-40s, direct handshake, the kind of professional composure that comes from years of sitting across tables from people in difficult situations and learning how to be the calmest person in the room. She had the trust documents laid out before I sat down. Patricia Gould had already submitted the transfer paperwork. Everything was in order. The formal transfer of assets would be complete within 5 business days. $240,000, moving from a managed trust account into a joint account Marcus and I had opened specifically for this purpose, clean and legal and entirely beyond anyone's reach. Claire Odom told me that Franklin's attorney had sent a letter to her office 3 days prior, indicating the family's intention to contest the trust on grounds of undue influence. Not cognitive decline, they had apparently reconsidered that angle after someone pointed out the capacity evaluation. Undue influence, meaning the argument would be that someone had manipulated Loretta into establishing the trust against her true wishes. Claire's expression when she explained this was the carefully neutral face of a lawyer who has an opinion she is choosing not to share out loud. I asked her what she thought the likelihood of a successful challenge was. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses and said, "Mrs. Webb, your grandmother documented every decision she made with the thoroughness of someone who expected to be questioned. There is nothing here to challenge." She said it the way you'd describe a door that was bolted from the inside. Final. Settled. I signed the transfer documents. Claire shook my hand. I walked back down the stairwell and stood on Sunflower Avenue in the late morning heat and breathed in the particular smell of Clarksdale in June, cut grass and asphalt warming up and something sweet from the bakery 2 doors down that had been there since I was a child. For a moment I just stood there. Then I got back in my car and drove to the coffee shop on Delta Avenue where Dana was waiting. Dana had saved me a corner table. She stood up when I walked in and hugged me before I could say anything, the kind of hug that carries an apology inside it without either person having to name it. We sat down. She looked tired in the way people look when they have been managing stress on behalf of someone else for a long time. I recognized it because I had looked that way for most of my 20s. She told me what had happened on the Clarksdale end since Franklin found out about the trust. He had discovered it 6 weeks ago, when a clerical matter connected to a property tax filing on Loretta's behalf had surfaced through the estate attorney. A routine inquiry had pulled up the trust filing, which was public record at the county level, and Franklin had apparently sat with that information for 2 weeks before telling anyone. Dana heard about it from Preston's wife, who had heard it from Preston, who had apparently spent an entire dinner processing the news with the kind of volume that made it impossible for anyone in the house not to hear. Franklin had not taken it quietly. He had not sat with it gracefully. He had moved through his own home like a weather system, according to Preston's wife, and the atmosphere at the Merritt House on Beaumont Drive had not recovered since. Dana looked at me carefully before she said the next part. She told me that Franklin had told Preston and Cynthia that the trust was proof that Loretta had never trusted him, that she had gone behind his back, that it was a betrayal. He had used that word. Betrayal. His mother, the woman who had raised him, who had attended every event of his life, who had sat in the front row at his wedding and held his children and loved him without condition for his entire life, had quietly and deliberately ensured that the daughter he had spent decades underinvesting in would be protected. And his response to that was to call it a betrayal. I let that sit on the table between Dana and me for a moment. Neither of us said anything. Sometimes a word indicts itself. I asked Dana how Preston was handling it. She said Preston was staying out of it mostly, which was the most honest thing she could have said about him. Preston had always been the beneficiary of Franklin's favoritism without being the architect of it, and there was a version of Preston that was decent enough to be uncomfortable with what he was seeing, even if he had never been brave enough to say so out loud when it might have made a difference. Dana said he had mentioned my name once in the context of the whole situation and said it wasn't fair, which was 3 years too late and 14 words too few, but was from Preston something. I finished my coffee. Dana walked me to my car. At the curb she stopped and looked at me and said, "I should have called you when Loretta died. I should have called you the second I heard she was sick. I knew your dad hadn't told you and I told myself it wasn't my place." She stopped. I waited. "That was wrong," she said. "I'm sorry." I looked at her. Dana and I had grown up together, shared Thanksgiving tables and Easter egg hunts, and the particular intimacy of a family that spends enough time together to know everyone's sore spots. She had looked at the floor at enough dinners where I was being diminished that the floor probably knew her face. But she was here now saying this and meaning it. I told her I appreciated it. I told her it mattered. I meant both things. I drove past the house on Beaumont Drive on my way out of town. I did not plan to. The route simply took me that way and I did not redirect it. The house looked the same, brick front, azaleas along the porch that Cynthia had planted the year I turned 12. The oak tree in the front yard that was taller now than it had any right to be. Franklin's car was in the driveway. I slowed without fully stopping. I looked at the front door for a moment. Then I pressed the gas and kept going. He called that evening. I was already back in Jackson, already home, already sitting on the back step with a glass of water and the particular relief of a person who has done a hard thing and is now on the other side of it. I answered. His voice was different this time. The baritone was still there, but the architecture underneath it had shifted. He sounded smaller, which is not a thing I say with satisfaction. He said he had heard I had been in town. He said he thought maybe we could have talked in person while I was there. I told him I had done what I came to do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother loved you very much." I told him I knew. He said, "I know I haven't always made that easy to see." I did not fill the silence that followed. I let it stay there and take up its full amount of space. After a moment he said he would like to talk sometime, not about the trust, not about lawyers. Just talk. I told him I would think about it. I told him my number hadn't changed. I ended the call and set my phone on the step beside me. Marcus came out a few minutes later with 2 glasses of iced tea and sat down next to me without asking about the call because he could read the shape of my quiet well enough by now to know it wasn't the bad kind. We sat on the back step in the warm Jackson evening and listened to the neighborhood settling around us and the cicadas starting up in the trees like they had an announcement to make. I thought about Grandma Loretta. About the yellow dress. About the powder blue Buick and the church hat and the $20 in the card. About a woman who had seen clearly what her son could not or would not, and had decided that clarity was worth acting on even if the action had to be invisible for 7 years. I am not the capable one. I am not the one who doesn't need anything. I am Reese. Loretta said so the day I was born and spent the rest of her life proving she meant it. The $240,000 was never the point. The point was the decision behind it. A woman in her 70s driving herself to a financial planner's office and saying, "My granddaughter has been overlooked long enough, and I am going to do something about that while I still can." That is what I carry. Not the money. The decision. The fact that someone saw my life clearly and chose to protect it without needing credit, without needing me to know, without needing anything in return except for me to one day be okay. I'm okay, Grandma. Better than okay. I think you knew that too. 18 months have passed since I drove out of Clarksdale with a signed transfer document in my folder and the smell of that bakery on Sunflower Avenue still faint in my memory. I want to tell you what 18 months looks like when you stop spending energy on things that were never going to give it back. I want to tell you what it feels like to wake up on a Tuesday in a life that is genuinely, quietly yours, not because everything went perfectly, not because every relationship got repaired, not because the people who hurt you had some dramatic awakening and came to you with tears and a changed heart, but because you stopped waiting for that to happen before you allowed yourself to be okay. That shift, small as it sounds, is the difference between surviving something and actually living past it. Marcus and I bought a house. Not the starter home we had been saving toward for years, carefully, cautiously, the way people save when they have learned not to count on anyone but themselves. A real house. A house with a porch that wraps around two sides and a backyard deep enough that the dog disappears into it every morning like she has somewhere important to be. We bought it in a neighborhood in Jackson where the streets are lined with old oak trees that have been there long enough to own the sidewalks, roots lifting the concrete in places, unbothered and permanent. We closed on it 7 months ago. I stood in the empty living room the first afternoon we had the keys, late light coming through the front windows, Marcus behind me with his hand on my shoulder, and I thought about every apartment I had white-knuckled my way through, every month I had paid rent alone and on time and without asking for anything, every year I had told myself that someday things would open up. Someday was standing in that room with me. It had arrived without fanfare the way the best things tend to. The trust money did not make us rich. I want to be clear about that because I think there is a version of this story where the money becomes the point, where the ending is about the amount, and I do not want to tell that version. What it did was remove a specific kind of pressure that I had been living under for so long I had stopped noticing its weight until it was gone. It paid off the last of my student loans, the ones I had been chipping away at for 11 years with the focused determination of someone defusing something slowly. It covered a portion of the down payment on the house. The remainder sits in an account that Marcus and I have not touched, not because we are waiting for something specific, but because there is a particular peace in knowing it is there. And for now that peace is worth more than whatever we might spend it on. Grandma Loretta would understand that. She was a woman who understood the value of something that simply exists quietly in reserve for when it is needed. Franklin did not challenge the trust. His attorney sent one follow-up letter to Claire Odom at Hadley and Croft approximately 3 weeks after my visit to Clarksdale, and Claire responded with a 4-page document summarizing the capacity evaluation, the 7-year filing history, the periodic updates and the legal cost projections for any challenge that proceeded to litigation. Franklin's attorney did not send a third letter. I found out about this through Dana, who found out through the particular information network that operates in small Mississippi towns through church parking lots and grocery store aisles and the kind of quiet conversations that happen between people who have known each other long enough to speak in half sentences. I was not surprised. Franklin Merritt had spent his career in insurance. He understood risk assessment better than most. The math on a challenge was bad and he knew it. He called me twice in the months that followed. The first call was brief and careful. 2 people feeling the edges of a conversation neither of them fully knew how to have. He asked about the house. I told him we were looking. He said he was glad. There was a long pause and then he said he had been thinking about some things and that he hoped I was doing well. I told him I was. The call lasted 7 minutes and ended the way it started, carefully with nothing resolved and nothing broken further, which felt, under the circumstances, like a form of progress. The second call was longer. He talked about Loretta. He said things about her that surprised me, not because they were revelations but because he had never said them to me before, things about how much she had loved me, specific memories, the kind of details that tell you a person has been sitting alone with something for a while. His voice was different in those moments. Smaller in the way I had heard on the evening I returned from Clarksdale, but less defended. More like a man than a performance of one. I did not forgive him in that phone call. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like mine are often expected to end with forgiveness presented as the final proof that the narrator is a good person, the bow that makes everything tidy. Forgiveness is not a door you walk through once and then you are done. It is something you return to unevenly on your own schedule in your own way without owing anyone a timeline. What I can tell you is that I no longer carry him the way I used to. I no longer lie awake turning his sentences over, looking for the version where they mean something different. I no longer wait for him to finally see me in the way I needed him to when I was young enough that it would have changed something fundamental. That waiting is finished. What is left in its place is not warmth exactly, not yet, maybe not ever fully, but it is something cleaner than what was there before. A kind of neutrality that does not require anything from either of us to maintain. Preston texted me on my birthday. For months ago, out of nowhere, no preamble, just happy birthday Reese, hope you guys are good. I stared at it for a while. Then I wrote back, thanks Preston, we are. It was 11 words between 2 people who grew up in the same house and became strangers through a combination of circumstances and choices and the particular damage that favoritism does to everyone it touches, including the favorite. I do not know what comes next with Preston. I'm not sure he does either. But 11 words felt like a beginning of something, even if neither of us can say yet what that something is. Cynthia has not called. I think about her sometimes in the way you think about a weather pattern that shaped your early life, Not fondly, not bitterly, just with the recognition that it was real and that it left marks and that the marks have mostly healed into something you can live with. Maybe she will call someday. Maybe she won't. I have stopped organizing my piece around that question. Dana and I have dinner once a month when she comes through Jackson for work. We talk about regular things, mostly her kids, my house, the restaurant we keep meaning to try and haven't yet. Occasionally we talk about the family, about Clarksdale, about Loretta. Those conversations are the ones I value most. Not because they resolve anything but because they are honest, and honesty between two people who grew up inside the same complicated thing is rarer and more valuable than most people realize until they finally have it. I visited Loretta's grave for the first time last October. I drove to Clarksdale on a weekday morning, just me, no plan beyond that. The cemetery was quiet in the way that cemeteries in the South are quiet in autumn, the light coming in low and gold through the trees, the air carrying the first real cold of the season. I found her stone without difficulty. I sat on the ground next to it for a while. I did not say much. I thanked her, which felt both insufficient and exactly right. I told her about the house. About the dog. About the porch that wraps around two sides and the oak trees on our street that have been there long enough not to apologize for the space they take up. I told her Marcus was good. I told her I was good. I meant it in the way I have only recently learned to mean it, not as reassurance, not as performance, but as a plain and accurate description of a life that belongs entirely to the person living it. My name is Reese Merritt Webb. I am 34 years old. And the most important thing I know, the thing I am still learning to carry without flinching, is this. Being overlooked by the people who were supposed to see you is not proof that you are invisible. It is proof that they were not looking. There is a difference. Grandma Loretta knew the difference before I did. She put $240,000 behind that knowledge and 7 years of patience and a formal psychological evaluation and a powder blue Buick and a yellow dress and $20 in a card in a parking lot in Oxford, Mississippi, because she understood something my father never quite could. That I was worth the effort. That I had always been worth the effort. And that if nobody else was going to make it, she would. She did. And I am here. And that is everything. If this story found you at the right moment, if some part of it sounded like your life or someone you love, then drop a comment below and tell me about it. I read every single one. And if you made it all the way to the end of this story, thank you. I mean that more than I can say. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional, real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.